All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend, my brother, Rick Perlstein. Rick is, of course, a writer, a historian, a New York Times best-selling author of both Before the Storm and Nixonland. He is a writer for The Nation magazine, which you can find at thenation.com. You can also find him on Twitter at Rick Perlstein. Rick, buddy, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Matt, it's always a pleasure. And mention Facebook, because that's really what I enjoy the most. I really get some very interesting conversations with my readers going on Facebook.
So Facebook, Rick Perlstein. That's how they find you.
Yeah. Hit me there.
Absolutely. So Rick, the city of Detroit, Michigan, has declared bankruptcy. Now, we're not sure if it's actually going to legally go through. That's something that's going to take a long time. But you actually recently wrote a really interesting piece at The Nation where you compare Detroit and add some historical context to what happened in New York City in the 1970s. So for people who don't actually know what happened in New York in the 70s, tell us what actually happened then.
Yeah, I mean, very basically, New York was loaned just kind of tons of money all through the 60s and 70s because it was kind of like a favorable thing for banks to do tax-wise, things like that. And also, the leaders of New York, in a kind of very interesting kind of experiment in what some people have called kind of socialism in one city, set up this really amazing kind of public welfare system. But it can be a misnomer to call it welfare because we think of that as sort of what you get if you don't have a job and the government pays you a check. They almost kind of built this kind of infrastructure for middle-class social democracy. They had free hospitals. They had free university system. They had something called the Mitchell-Lama housing, which was basically subsidized middle-class housing, and free museums. Even free things that cost money in different cities, like directory assistance. And that was an amazing thing, but it cost a lot of money. And all this really kind of hit the wall during the recession of 1974 and 1975, such that, and something that was really kind of shocking to everyone in the whole world, New York suddenly announced that they couldn't pay their bills. And even more importantly, these banks, which were very cynical in a lot of ways because they were the ones who loaned them the money in the first place on such favorable terms, suddenly said they wouldn't loan them money anymore. And one of the main reasons was because it was just kind of suddenly more profitable for them to loan it elsewhere to places like these resource-rich third world countries. And Detroit, New York.
Don't get ahead of yourself here. We'll get to there. We'll get to there soon.
and New York basically kind of came hand in hand with the federal government and said, look, the greatest city in the world might not be able to pay its bills unless you help us out. And basically the argument was New York City, which is the financial capital of the world and the kind of jewel of culture for the United States, is too big to fail. This is part of a national system. Please help us out here. And very famously, after kind of entertaining the idea, a bunch of his conservative aides, Donald Rumsfeld among them, said, you can't do this. And even more importantly, a guy named William Simon, who we'll talk about more, said, if we do this, every city in the country is going to come hand in hand. And basically, a lot of these guys, this is kind of coincident with the rise of neoconservatism, said, look, this is a great way to set an example for the rest of the country that liberalism is a failure, that the problem here is not the behavior of the banks, even though it was largely the behavior of the banks, but liberalism itself. And this guy, William Simon, started saying just crazy stuff. Let me find this. Doing the old cut and paste here. Why don't you ask me another question while I find that?
Well, again, while I'm talking here, we're talking to my good friend, Rick Perlstein. He is an author, he is a historian, he is a writer for The Nation magazine, where we're talking about his current column on what's going on in Detroit and how it has historical parallels to what happened in New York City in the 70s. This also is something that ties into kind of the early stages of what has come to be known as the shock doctrine, where we have these conservatives, whenever a type of crisis hits, doing all types of things of privatization and whatnot.
My brother.
All right, let's do it. All right.
Eureka. So William Simon wrote this book, A Time to Truth, which became a bestseller. It was published by Reader's Digest Press. He was Gerald Ford's Treasury Secretary. And this is what he had to say about the opportunity, really, that was provided by the bankruptcy of New York, or basically the fiscal crisis of New York. He said, the philosophy that had ruled our nation for over 40 years had emerged in large measure from what that very city, which was America's intellectual headquarters, and inevitably it was carried to its fullest expression in that city. Terrible sentence, right? In the collapse of New York, those who choose to understand it could see a terrifying dress rehearsal of the state that lies ahead for this country if it continues to be guided by the same philosophy of government. Nothing has destroyed New York's finances but the liberal political formula. Liberal politics, endlessly glorifying its own, quote, humanism, has in fact been annihilating the very conditions for human survival.
Wow.
Now, I kind of have a funny little reveal there, because it turns out that same guy, William Simon, had been an executive at Salomon Brothers in charge of their bond department, and he was the guy who loaned them all the money.
Yeah. He's the man who loans New York City this money at good interest rates and allows New York to do all this stuff. Then eventually becomes on staff for Gerald Ford, and then ends up writing this book, also, decrying the fact that New York City did all this stuff that he actually had giving them the actual money for. Unbelievable.
Well, it's more than he wrote a book. I mean, as Treasury Secretary, he told Gerald Ford that basically he had to let the city, in the famous headline in the New York Daily News, drop dead. So Gerald Ford, basically on Halloween, which is kind of a funny little paradox.
He kind of looks like a pumpkin. Yeah. So.
Yeah, maybe. Basically, kind of ventriloquized what William Simon had been saying in this very famous speech. He said, "I can tell you now that I am prepared to veto any bill that has as its purpose a federal bailout of New York City to prevent default. If they can scare the whole country into providing that alternative, it would promise immediate rewards, huh? It's like they want the candy, and eventual rescue to every other city that follows the tragic example of our largest city. Our cities, other states, as well as the federal government, are not immune to the insidious disease from which New York City is suffering. This sickness is brought on by years and years of higher spending, higher deficits, more inflation, and more borrowing to pay for higher spending, higher deficits, and so on and on and so on. It is a progressive disease, and there is no painless cure. If we go on spending more than we have, providing more benefits and services than we can pay for, then a day of reckoning will come to Washington and the whole country, just as it has to New York." I mean, almost this idea of this kind of parasites and these diseases. I mean, this is kind of ugly rhetoric, especially when aimed at a city that is full of Jews and minorities.
Mm-hmm.
But it was very opportunistic. It was the chance that the capitalist class had to say, no more. This whole post-war liberal accommodation, we're pulling the plug on that whole thing.
So it is a shock doctrine. So what actually happened to New York after Ford told them to drop dead? What happened then?
Well, I didn't have that part of the story, but, it's very interesting. I mean, basically, the Chancellor of Germany, for example, said, look, you got to do this or else there's going to be, riots in the streets.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is America needed New York. So Ford actually turned around and did sign the bill that gave a bailout package to New York. So in the end, the good guys won and New York survived. And, you don't hear about that, when it comes to people talking about New York's comeback. It's all kind of blamed on, mountebanks and blackguards like Ed Koch and Rudy Giuliani, but it was really kind of concerted national action from Washington that saved it.